I'll never forget the sight of red and blue flashing lights filling our driveway. At first, I thought maybe there'd been an accident at the corner or a break-in next door. But when I opened the door and saw two uniformed officers standing stiffly, hands hovering near their belts, my heart nearly stopped. They weren't here for me. They weren't even here for trouble in the neighborhood. They were here for my wife. And across the street, half hidden under the porch light, stood Richard Callahan, the smug president of our HOA, watching like he'd just orchestrated the perfect trap. But Richard had no idea the woman he'd just sicked the cops on wasn't some frightened homeowner he could bully. She was the county sheriff, and he had just made the worst mistake of his life. 6 months earlier, this neighborhood had looked like a dream. Claire and I had been searching for months for someplace quieter, calmer, someplace where she could actually breathe when she came home from 12-hour shifts in uniform. She loved her job. Being sheriff wasn't just a career, it was a calling. But it weighed on her. The emergencies, the politics, the ugliness. At home, she needed peace. When we found Willow Creek Estates, it felt like destiny. Tree-lined streets, perfectly trimmed lawns, families walking dogs and waving to strangers, like they'd known you forever. The real estate brochure had words like idyllic, resort style, living, and safe, family-friendly community. I remember the day we closed. Claire stood in the driveway, eyes wet with relief. "This is it," she whispered. "This is where I want to build our future." For the first couple of weeks, it did feel perfect. Neighbors waved. Kids rode bikes on the cul-de-sac. The lake sparkled in the evenings when we walked down to the gazebo. But paradise always hides cracks. The first crack came in the form of an envelope. Notice of violation. Apparently, our garbage cans had been visible 40 minutes past the approved retrieval time. Fine, $75. I laughed. Claire frowned. "They're testing us," she said flatly. I brushed it off. Paid the fine. 2 weeks later, another envelope. Mailbox color does not conform to community standards. Fine, $100. Then, shrubs not from approved list. $150. Then, unauthorized flag dimensions. $200. It was absurd. But every single notice had the same name at the bottom. Richard Callahan, HOA president. Richard was a retired insurance salesman with nothing better to do than stalk the neighborhood with a clipboard. He had a permanent sneer, a belly he carried like a badge of honor, and a hunger for control that seeped out of every pore. Claire sized him up fast. Men like him, they don't stop. They'll push until you break. I wanted peace, so I kept paying. But every fine made Claire's jaw tighten, just a little more. The breaking point came the morning she parked her marked sheriff's SUV in the driveway. She'd just come off a brutal shift, 2 arrests, 1 domestic dispute, and was too tired to bother pulling into the garage. Richard was on her in minutes. "You can't park that here," he barked, stomping across the street. Claire blinked at him, still in uniform. "Excuse me. That police car. It's intimidating. This is a family neighborhood." Claire actually laughed. "It's a legal vehicle, Richard. Perfectly allowed. Not under HOA rules. We don't want law enforcement scaring people here. You'll be fined. Every day that thing sits in your driveway." And with that, he strutted back like he delivered divine judgment. I tried to calm Claire down, but she wasn't having it. "He's not just petty. He's dangerous. He's going to make us a target." She was right. The fines escalated. $50, $100, $200. Then came newsletters thinly veiled as attacks. Certain residents think they're above the rules. The atmosphere shifted. Neighbors who once waved now looked away. Children were hurried indoors when Claire's SUV pulled up. Richard's poison was spreading. Still, Claire endured. She dealt with far worse in her career. But I could see the fire building behind her eyes. Then came the night of flashing lights. That was the night paradise shattered. It was a Thursday evening. Claire had just gotten home, still in uniform, sipping tea at the kitchen table. I was watching the news when the sudden wash of red and blue light filled the room. "Not again," Claire muttered. setting her mug down. Two cruisers idled in the driveway. Officers stepped out, uncertain. Their hands weren't on their guns, but they stood stiff, wary. "Evening, ma'am," one said carefully. "We had a call from a concerned resident. Said there might be the situation here." Richard emerged from across the street, hands on his hips. "Yes, officers, it's her. She's been abusing her position, harassing residents, and using that police vehicle to intimidate the neighborhood." The officers glanced at each other, clearly uncomfortable. One leaned toward Claire. "Ma'am, you're the sheriff, right?" Claire lifted her badge, her voice steady as stone. "Yes, and this man has now filed a false report against law enforcement. Twice." Richard faltered. She's dangerous," he sputtered. "She threatened me." Claire took a deliberate step toward him. "The only threat here is you wasting county resources for your personal vendettas. Do it again, and you'll be the one in handcuffs." The officers exchanged glances, muttered apologies, and left. Richard, red-faced and sputtering, stomped back across the street. Inside, Claire exhaled slowly. "He's trying to push me into a mistake, but he doesn't know. I've played this game longer than he's been breathing." Over the next month, the harassment escalated into psychological warfare. Anonymous notes appeared in our mailbox. "Sheriffs don't belong here." Sidewalk chalk messages scrawled near our driveway. "Rule breakers." Even neighbors we'd thought were friends grew distant. One woman whispered, "We don't want trouble," before hurrying away with her kids. Richard had turned the community into his weapon. One night, I found Claire sitting at the kitchen table, piles of HOA documents spread before her. She looked up, eyes blazing with determination. "He thinks he's smart. He thinks hiding behind rules makes him untouchable. But these numbers," she tapped a column of expenses, "these numbers don't add up. Landscaping, security contracts, maintenance fees, all inflated. Money's disappearing." She leaned back, jaw tight. "This isn't just harassment. It's theft." The true breaking point came on a humid summer afternoon. I was mowing the lawn when I noticed a man in a reflective vest taking pictures of our house. He measured the mailbox, the fence, even the distance between shrubs. Claire stepped outside, voice sharp. "Can I help you?" The man barely glanced up. "Routine HOA compliance inspection." Claire's eyes narrowed. "Funny, since you're not on any licensed contractor list. Who are you?" "Really?" He hesitated, then muttered, "I work for the board." Richard stood at the curb, watching with crossed arms, that smug grin plastered across his face. Claire's voice turned icy. "If I catch you on my property again without authorization, I'll treat it as trespassing. Do you understand me?" The man scurried off. Richard just smirked. That night, Claire spread more documents across the table. Vendor contracts, payment, ledgers, all riddled with inconsistencies. "He's laundering money," she said quietly, "and I'm going to prove it." Her eyes met mine, and I saw it. The shift from frustration to deadly focus. The same focus she used in interrogations, in manhunts, in cases where failure wasn't an option. Richard thought he was playing a neighborhood game, but Claire was preparing for war. By the time July rolled around, Claire's office looked less like a home study and more like a crime lab. Stacks of HOA documents were piled high on the desk. Vendor contracts spread across the floor. Highlighters, sticky notes, and tabs marked inconsistencies. She had created timelines, cross-referenced invoices, even drawn diagrams linking payments to suspicious accounts. One night, I peeked in to find her pinning receipts to a corkboard like pieces of a puzzle. She didn't even notice me at first. She was that focused. "Claire," I said softly, "you've put in more hours on this than some of your county cases." Her pen scratched across a ledger. "Because this is a case, Dan. It's fraud hiding in plain sight." She tapped a page with her pen. "Look, $12,000 for monthly landscaping. But the landscapers told me they only get $2,500. Where's the other $9,500 going?" "Straight into Richard's pocket." Another page. Security contract. Except there's no security company. It's a shell account. He's billing residents for services that don't exist. I whistled low. How much are we talking about? Her jaw tightened. Tens of thousands. Maybe more. And then she said something that sent a chill down my spine. Dan, this isn't just mismanagement. This is criminal embezzlement. And I'm going to nail him. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Normally they were. Sleepy affairs, half the seats empty. Richard droning on about paint colors and lawn heights. But Claire planned to turn this one into a reckoning. For 3 nights straight, she prepared. She created binders of evidence, copies of bank statements, photos of checks deposited into Richard's personal account. She even filed a quiet report with the county prosecutor's office, just enough to get the ball rolling. On Monday night, she slid a heavy binder across the kitchen table toward me. Tomorrow, I'm going to confront him. In front of everyone. I frowned. Are you sure? He's vindictive, Claire. If you corner him, he might. She cut me off with a look I'd seen her use in interrogation rooms. Calm, sharp, unshakable. Bullies like Richard thrive in shadows. He's been intimidating people for years, because no one stood up to him. Tomorrow, we drag him into the light. Tuesday evening, the community center buzzed with an unusual energy. Word had spread about the showdown. Neighbors filled every seat, whispers bouncing off the walls. Even people who normally avoided meetings showed up, curiosity and tension drawing them in. Richard sat at the head of the table, gavel in hand, smug as ever. He clearly thought tonight would be just another opportunity to flex his power. All right, let's begin, he said, his voice booming. First order of business, repeated. Non-compliance by the Thompsons. Actually, Claire interrupted, standing from her seat in the front row. The first order of business should be accountability. The room went still. Richard scowled. Sit down, Mrs. Thompson. You're out of order. Claire walked forward, calm but commanding. She placed a massive binder on the table with a loud thud. No, Richard, you're out of order. She flipped the binder open, pages bristling with tabs. For months, you've harassed us with false fines, intimidation tactics, even false police reports. But while you were busy targeting my family, you left a trail of financial fraud big enough to bury you. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Richard laughed nervously. This is nonsense. Fabricated. Slander. No, Claire snapped, her voice cutting like a blade. She pulled out a sheet of paper and held it high. This is a bank statement showing $9,500 deposited directly into your personal account from HOA funds. Here's another, $7,200 funneled through a fake security contract. Shall I go on? The room erupted in murmurs. Neighbors leaned forward, craning to see. Richard slammed his gavel. This is out of line. You can't just. Can't just what? Claire shot back. Show the truth. You've been bleeding this community. Dry while hiding behind a set of rules you weaponized against innocent families. And I've already handed everything over to the county prosecutor's office. That last sentence hit like a hammer. Gasps turned to open outrage. Someone in the back shouted, Is that why our fees keep going up? Another voice cried, You stole from us? Richard's face drained of color. He tried to gavel the room into silence, but his hand shook. Claire didn't stop. She turned to the neighbors. How many of you have been fined unfairly? How many of you paid because you were scared? Hands went up across the room. People shouted stories, bogus citations, threats of liens, intimidation. Years of bottled frustration poured out all at once. For the first time, Richard wasn't in control. I watched his facade crack. His cheeks flushed. His voice wavered. He stammered denials. But the evidence was undeniable, the crowd relentless. One man in the back shouted, You're finished, Richard. Another yelled, We want our money back. It was chaos, neighbors shouting, Richard trying to gavel louder, his allies shrinking into their chairs. And in the middle of it all stood Claire, calm and resolute, binder open like a weapon of truth. She wasn't just exposing him. She was dismantling his entire kingdom of fear. And Richard knew it. For the first time, I saw it in his eyes. Not arrogance, not smug control, but pure, unfiltered fear. That was the turning point. The moment Richard realized the game he'd been playing wasn't just a neighborhood spat anymore. It was a criminal case. And my wife, the sheriff, was the one holding the cards. Right. The HOA meeting had dissolved into chaos. Neighbors who had once been silent, cowed by Richard's bullying, now shouted over one another, their frustration bubbling out after years of bottled fear. Some waved their violation, letters in the air like proof of war crimes. Others demanded refunds, justice, answers. Richard's face was crimson, sweat glistening on his forehead. He slammed the gavel so hard the handle cracked. Order, order, I said. But no one was listening anymore. His power, the illusion of control he'd maintained for so long, was evaporating before his eyes. And Claire stood at the center of it all, calm and immovable, binder of evidence open on the table like the smoking gun it was. Richard tried to regain footing. This is all a misunderstanding. The funds were allocated properly. You're twisting numbers. Claire flipped to another tabbed section, her voice cutting through the din. Here's a copy of a landscaping invoice for $10,000. I spoke directly to the contractor. He received $2,500. The other $7,500 went directly into an account under your name. Gasps rippled through the crowd. And here, she continued, pulling another sheet, a so-called security contract with a company that doesn't exist. Payments deposited monthly into an account opened just 6 months after you became HOA president. Care to explain that, Richard? Richard's mouth opened, then shut again. He looked like a fish gasping for air. You can't prove anything, he spat finally, his voice cracking. Claire's gaze hardened. I don't have to. The prosecutor's office already has copies. This meeting is just a courtesy, so your neighbors know exactly who's been stealing from them. The room exploded. Shouts of betrayal, anger, disbelief filled the air. Someone yelled, "You stole from my kid's college fund." Another screamed, "You bullied us into paying lies." Richard's gavel slipped from his sweaty grip, clattering uselessly against the table. For years, he'd ruled them with fear. But now the crowd surged forward, not physically, but emotionally, voices rising, anger uniting. An elderly woman, Mrs. Lee, stood up, her hands trembling but her voice steady. I paid over $5,000 in fines. $5,000. I thought it was my fault. I thought I was failing to follow the rules. But you, she pointed a shaking finger at Richard, you were stealing from us all along. Others joined in. The Johnsons, who had nearly moved away because of constant citations. The Lopez family, who'd been fined for their holiday decorations. One by one, neighbors, who'd lived in fear, found their voices. Richard shrank in his chair, the walls closing in. Through it all, Claire didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She let the neighbors speak. Let their anger drown Richard. And when the room finally quieted enough, she delivered the final blow. You've broken more than HOA bylaws, Richard. You've committed fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of power. And as sheriff of this county, I assure you, justice will be served. She closed the binder with a decisive snap that echoed across the hall. Richard's jaw dropped. The reality of who he had picked to fight with finally seemed to sink in. This wasn't just a neighbor with a badge. This was the law. The days that followed moved like storm. Subpoenas were issued. Bank accounts frozen. Richard's allies on the board were questioned by investigators. County officials swept through HOA records with the same meticulousness Claire had used. And then came the morning no one in Willow Creek Estates would forget. I was sipping coffee on the porch when 2 county cruisers rolled into the cul-de-sac. Officers stepped out, not hesitant this time, not confused. Determined. Richard stumbled out of his house in his bathrobe, shouting, "This is a mistake. This is harassment." The lead officer read him his rights as cuffs clicked around his wrists. Neighbors gathered. Phones out, recording. Some whispered in shock. Others openly cheered. For years, Richard had strutted down these streets like a king. Now he was being marched away like a criminal. Claire stood at our window, arms crossed. No gloating smile. No arrogance. Just quiet. Satisfaction. He thought he could twist the law to his will, she murmured. But the law doesn't bend for bullies. The arrest shattered what little remained of his empire. Within a week, the HOA board disbanded under pressure from outraged residents. Special meetings were held to rewrite bylaws, to rebuild trust. Neighbors who once avoided us now came to our door with gratitude. "Thank you for standing up to him," Mrs. Lee said tearfully. "We were all too scared." The Johnsons brought over a pie, awkwardly admitting they'd once believed Richards. "Rumors about us. We're sorry. We should have known better." Claire just shook her head. "You don't need to apologize. Fear makes people quiet. What matters is, you're not quiet anymore." And for the first time since moving in, Willow Creek Estates felt like a real community. Flags waved proudly on porches. Kids chalked the sidewalks without fear of fines. Claire's SUV sat in the driveway, not as a violation, but as a symbol. For a moment, it seemed like peace had finally returned. But paradise never stays perfect for long. The days after Richard's arrest felt like waking up from a long nightmare. For the first time in months, our mailbox didn't hold a violation notice. No anonymous notes. No false accusations. Just the quiet hum of a neighborhood trying to remember what peace felt like. But the scars were still there. Neighbors approached us hesitantly at first, like children testing the waters after a storm. Some apologized for their silence. Others confessed to things they'd endured. Mrs. Lopez admitted she'd been fined over holiday decorations, lights she strung up for her kids every Christmas. He said they were a safety hazard. "I paid because I didn't want trouble." Her voice broke. That was money we didn't have. The Johnsons told us they'd nearly sold their house. He fined us for having too many guests. When our family visited, said it was an unauthorized gathering. We thought we couldn't live here anymore. Story after story spilled out, proof of just how deep Richard's intimidation ran. Claire listened to each one, never rushing, never brushing it aside. She carried their pain like evidence, adding it to the case she'd already made. "You don't have to live in fear anymore," she told them. "Not from him. Not from anyone." Slowly, Willow Creek Estates began to heal. The board was dissolved, replaced with a temporary committee of volunteers. Fines were suspended. HOA fees reevaluated. And something unexpected happened too. For the first time, neighbors began acting like a community. Not because they were forced to buy a rule book, but because they wanted to. We held a block party. Kids drew chalk murals on the sidewalks, the same sidewalks Richard once patrolled for violations. Families flew flags of all shapes and colors. Music drifted across the cul-de-sac without fear of citations. Claire's SUV sat in the driveway, not as a mark of intimidation, but as a symbol, a reminder that justice could stand its ground, even in the quietest corners of suburbia. One evening, sitting on the porch as fireflies danced across the lawn, Claire finally allowed herself a smile. "You know," she said softly, "when I took this badge, I thought I'd face down criminals, gangs, maybe even corruption in City Hall. Never thought the hardest fight would be against a homeowners association." I chuckled. Evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears khakis and a clipboard. Her laughter was soft, tired, but real. For the first time in months, I felt like we could breathe. We thought it was over. We thought the war had ended. But we were wrong. It was a Sunday morning when I found it. An envelope in our mailbox. No return address. No markings. Just a single sheet of paper. Inside, I unfolded it at the kitchen table, frowning. Claire leaned over my shoulder. It wasn't a threat. Not exactly. It was a photocopy of a bank transfer. $6,800, drawn from HOA funds, deposited into an account under a name we recognized. But it wasn't Richard's. It belonged to someone else. Someone we'd seen at every board meeting, sitting quietly at Richard's side. a neighbor who'd pretended to be just another victim, nodding along as Richard barked orders. Someone who'd even whispered sympathy to us once or twice. Across the top of the page, in thick black marker, were 5 chilling words. Richard wasn't the only one. Claire's face hardened. She set the paper down slowly, her hand steady, but her jaw tight. "This isn't over," she said. I felt the chill run through me. Richard was in jail, yes. His empire was crumbling. But corruption, like his, never grows alone. It spreads, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. And someone out there had just sent us a warning, or a challenge. Claire looked out the window at the rows of perfect houses, the manicured lawns, the families going about their day as if nothing had changed. Her voice was calm, but I knew that fire was back. "If they want to keep playing games," she murmured, "then we'll play. But this time we know the rules." The war with Richard was over, but the battle for Willow Creek Estates? That had only just begun. What about you? What would you do if you discovered your neighbors were part of something bigger, something darker than anyone realized? Would you keep fighting, or would you pack up and leave? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. And if you've ever had your own HOA horror story, share it. I might feature it in a future episode. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss what comes next. Because trust me, this story, it isn't over.